The hydrant beside the loading dock coughed one mouthful of rust into my glove, and then it went dead. Dead. I was already half in the warehouse, one boot on the dock plate, the other sliding on wet soot, when I felt the line lose pressure in my hands. The hose shuddered like a snake with its spine cut out. Above me, the sprinkler pipes were popping in the heat, and the whole place stank of melted plastic, pallet wood, and that sharp chemical bite that tells you somebody poured something on purpose. My probationer, a kid named Nolan, was 3 steps behind me, mask fogged, eyes wide, trying to keep his voice steady on the radio. I told him to stay low and keep moving. He said, "Copy, Captain." And then the rack in the center aisle gave a long, ugly groan. That sound stays with you. I had 3 weeks left until retirement. 3 weeks. That was all. I'd already run enough fires to know when a building was fighting back, and this one was fighting too clean, too even. The flames didn't crawl the way a broken wire fire crawls. They ran in a fan, spread fast and low across the floor, licking the legs of the steel shelving in a pattern I'd seen before and never liked. The hydrant should have bought us time. Instead, it handed us nothing. When I looked back out toward the street, I saw the engine crew hauling on the supply line like they were trying to drag water out of stone. No pressure. That was the moment my gut dropped through the floor. I pushed deeper anyway, because that's what you do when somebody's inside and the clock is chewing on them. Nolan was supposed to be a few months from getting off probation. Good kid, eager, still believed the job was about courage and clean saves and going home with your hands a little singed. I found him near the back bay, crouched under a hanging chain curtain, one hand up over his mask, the other reaching for a doorway that was already feeding fire. I grabbed his coat and yanked him back hard enough to slam him into my chest. We moved 2 steps. Then the ceiling made that hollow, exhausted crack that every firefighter learns to hate. I shoved him toward the side exit. "Go!" He started to move, then stopped, looking past me. I turned and saw the fire roll under the roof beams, black smoke punching down through the light like a fist. Something in the structure failed all at once, a real one. The kind that turns a room into a trap. I got one arm around Nolan and tried to push him through the smoke line, but the heat hit us full in the face, and the world went white at the edges. For half a second, I thought we'd make it. For half a second, I thought the old rules still mattered. Then the floor shivered. A stack of freight pallets dropped somewhere behind us. Steel screamed overhead. Nolan slipped out of my grip, and I caught the strap of his breathing mask just long enough to hear him cough once, hard, sharp, then nothing but the radio crackle in my ear and the roar of the fire eating the room. I got him out by the shoulder, half carried him across the dock, and I'll tell you the truth, I knew before the medics even got to us. I knew by the way his chest stopped fighting. I knew by the way his glove went slack in mine. Outside, the street was full of red strobes and shouted orders, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was staring at the hydrant box on the curb, fresh paint on the cover, fresh cuts on the municipal seal. Somebody had opened that system up, capped the mains, and closed it back like a man buttoning a jacket. Work. I looked back at the warehouse, at the burn tracks on the loading bay floor, and the shape of it hit me in the gut. That fan pattern, the accelerant signature. I had seen it before, in 4 different depots that were supposed to have burned down from wiring failures. 4 places with the same story, the same insurance payout, the same cheap cleanup, the same sudden sale of dockside land to the same development firm. And as the smoke thinned, I saw a man on the sidewalk in a clean raincoat and a hard hat that didn't belong there, watching the scene like he was checking a job off a list. If you want the rest of this hunt, hit like and subscribe, because by the time I walked up to that curb, I already knew the first man who had to answer for Nolan's death was standing right in front of me. I didn't move on that man in the raincoat right away. I stood there in the gray wash of the engine lights, my gloves still wet with soot, and watched him slip behind a county SUV like he had every right to be on that curb. The warehouse behind me was still breathing smoke. Hot tar, wet concrete, burnt plastic. That smell was going to live in my coat for weeks. A medic had already zipped Nolan into a black bag and rolled him away, but my eyes kept dropping back to the hydrant box by the curb. Fresh paint, fresh tool marks. Somebody had opened it, capped the line, and covered it back up like a bad repair job. A setup. I crossed the street without thinking about my knees or my age or the fact that I had 3 weeks left on the clock. The cap on the hydrant was city brass, but the threads were scored where a wrench had bitten too hard. And tucked under the collar of the access panel was a scrap of orange utility tape with a hand-scrawled number on it. A work order. My thumb rubbed the paper and came back black. Grease. Fresh. That's when I started looking at the fire like it was a map instead of a disaster. The scorch geometry on the loading bay floor was wrong for a bad wire. Too wide, too even. The burn climbed in a fan shape from 3 separate low points, and in each one I could smell the same sweet, oily note an hour after the hose water had turned the place into mud. Accelerant. Poured, not spilled. Whoever said it knew exactly how long the fire needed to sit before it took the roof. I went back inside with the cleanup crew and one of the younger lieutenants who still wanted to talk like the paperwork mattered. He kept saying the investigation would sort itself out. I told him to save his breath and show me the rear wall. The rear wall had a service door that should have been warped open by heat, but the latch was still locked from the outside. That was the part that made my jaw tighten. If Nolan had been taken off that line by heat alone, that door would have been blown apart by panic long before the roof came down. Instead, somebody had locked the exit and made sure the hydrants were dry. I photographed everything I could get my hands on without turning the scene into a circus. The melted rack in aisle 3, the black streaks near the electrical panel that weren't electrical at all, the little rain of blistered glass on the floor where the fire had flashed sideways when it hit pooled fuel. And then I found the thing that made the whole night turn a little colder. Pinned to a clipboard in the command tent was the inspection packet for the warehouse, still damp at the edges. The building had been signed off 2 weeks earlier as condemned, faulty wiring. Same language as the old depot cases I had been pulling from memory. Same neat stamp, same signature block. Inspector Nolan Pike. I stared at that name long enough for the noise around me to thin out, because it fit too well. By the time the sun started to bleach the smoke out of the sky, I had the first 4 warehouse files spread across the hood of my truck. Different addresses, same developer, same insurance carrier, same inspector stamp, same storyline from the same people in the same uniforms. The precinct report would call it a string of bad luck if I let them. They would call Nolan's death an unfortunate collapse. They would call the dead hydrant a maintenance issue and be done with it. I was still bent over the papers when my radio crackled once, low and sharp. One of the yard guys whispered my name and said there was a man from city inspections asking for me by the apparatus bay, and he wasn't alone. The man from inspections was still standing by the apparatus bay when I came back out, and the way he held his clipboard told me he wasn't there for routine business. He had a neat gray coat, clean shoes, and that smooth face some people wear when they've already decided the answer for you. Beside him stood a broad-shouldered driver in a dark jacket, hands clasped in front of him like he was waiting for a prayer to end. Both of them looked dry and rested in a place that still smelled like wet ash and burned insulation. The contrast alone made my skin tighten. "You're Captain Reed?" the inspector asked. "Depends who's asking." He gave a small smile. "City Safety Office. We need a statement on the warehouse collapse. There's no reason to make this harder than it is." I stared at him. Harder for who? His eyes flicked once to the black bag on the gurney near the curb, then back to me, calm as a man ordering coffee. "Accidents happen. Old buildings go. Hydrants fail. The report will settle out." That was the exact tone I'd heard from men who'd already bought the ending. I didn't touch him. I didn't need to. I just looked at the leather folder under his arm and caught the corner of a stamp I knew too well. Condemned. Faulty wiring. Same neat block, same quick approval. Nolan Pike's name wasn't on the jacket, but it might as well have been written across his forehead. The driver shifted his weight, and I noticed powdered drywall on his boots. Dockside dust, the kind you get from old storage walls and cheap demo work. He had spent part of the night where the warehouses sat. "Tell your people," I said, keeping my voice flat, "that I'm not signing anything until I see the full file." The inspector's smile thinned. "You're tired, Captain. Grief makes men see patterns." "Then you won't mind if I keep looking." He held my stare a second longer, then closed the folder with 2 soft taps. "Be careful what you dig up." They left in a black sedan with no markings and tinted glass so dark I couldn't see a face inside. I watched the car roll off slow, no hurry at all. That told me enough. I went inside and asked for the archive room. The records clerk knew me from years of fire inspections and mutual aid drills, so she didn't ask why I wanted the old depot files. She just handed me the key and said if anyone was looking, she hadn't seen me. The room smelled like toner, dust, and hot metal from an old copier that never really stopped humming. I laid the first 4 folders out under the fluorescent light and opened them one by one. There it was again. Same developer, same insurance carrier, same electrical fault language, same inspector signature. But this time, I went 1 layer deeper and pulled the land transfer sheets from the back pages. Every burned depot had been sold within days of the payout, not to random buyers, to one holding company that had the same mailing address as the developer's legal office. The lots were all dockside, all undervalued, all cleared for the next phase of redevelopment. The whole thing had the smell of a rigged relay. Fire, payout, purchase, demolition, repeat. I flipped through the map inserts until the pattern hit me full in the face. Each site sat next to a service corridor, a dead stretch of line, or an older pipe branch that could be shut down fast. Not random at all. The fires were built around the weak points. Somebody knew the city's bones. Somebody had planned for the dry standpipe and the dead hydrant before the first match ever struck. I called the utility foreman from my truck on the way out. 1 question, 1 answer. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "Those caps?" They were pulled and reset by a subcontractor working from a city-approved work order, signed off through inspections. "Who signed it?" He didn't hesitate. "Pike's office." That was the moment the warehouse fire stopped being a case and started being a machine. Pike wasn't just stamping papers. He was laying the track, and the developer was collecting the money at the end of it. I sat there with the phone in my hand and thought about Nolan, about his face through the smoke, about how fast the room had turned, and how clean the whole thing had been. Too clean. That was the ugly part. It meant the kid never had a chance. When I climbed out of the truck, my windshield wiper was pinned up. Something white was tucked under it. I reached for it, and the paper felt cold as tile in my hand. 1 line, no name, no signature. "Stop looking at the depots." I folded the note once, then again, and slid it into the breast pocket of my shirt like it might bite. The parking lot behind the station was bright with noon sun, but the air still carried that stale mix of diesel, wet rubber, and old coffee that lives around firehouses. I stood by my truck with the door open, looking at the paper and thinking about who had enough nerve to walk up to my wiper and tell me to back off. The handwriting was plain block print, no flourish, no threat you could wave in a room, just a clean line from somebody who wanted me to know they were close. So I went back inside and checked the archive room again. That room had its own little world of dust and heat. Steel shelves, yellow folders, old incident books with warped corners from years of sweat and hose water. I laid the note under the desk lamp and compared the paper to the inspection packet I'd pulled earlier. Same cheap stock, same faint blue grid under the fibers. City form paper, the kind used for work orders and safety notices, which meant the note came from the same supply chain as Pike's stamps, or from someone who had access to them. I stared at that long enough for the room to go quiet around me. Then I did what firemen do. I stopped thinking like a victim and started reading the scene. If Pike wanted me scared, he'd sent the note from a place that could be traced back to his office. If the developer wanted me moved off the depots, they already knew I'd found the paper trail, which meant the next move wouldn't be another warning. It would be a test. I called the utility foreman again and asked him one thing. Who had signed off on the capped hydrants besides Pike? He took a long breath before answering. A subcontractor name keeps coming up. Vale Site Services. They do demolition fencing, temporary water shutoffs, cleanup. Always on emergency call. Always paperwork clean. Who fronts them? Same holding company as the developer. Same lawyer. Same office tower. That lined up too neatly to be luck. Vale Site Services didn't sound like a killer crew. It sounded like a crew that could walk through a gate with clipboards and nobody would stop them. That's how these jobs get done. Not with ski masks and broken glass. With badges, hard hats, and the right envelope on the right desk. I drove to the first burned depot after that. The lot was half cleared already. Broken concrete, bent chain link, a fence panel leaning inward where a loader had clipped it. The smell there was different from the station. Not smoke anymore. Just damp ash, gravel dust, and the sour edge of burned insulation buried under rainwater. I walked the edge of the slab and found the old main access point under a fresh padlock. New chain, new seal. Too new. Somebody had come back after the fire and locked the bones of the place shut. That told me all I needed about who was still visiting. On the far side of the lot, behind a stack of black plastic pipe, I saw a white utility van parked with no logo on the doors. Clean enough to be new, dirty enough to be working. A man in a safety vest got out, glanced around once, and started toward the fence with a clipboard tucked under his arm. Same move, same posture, same calm shoulders I'd seen at the station. Not a laborer, a courier, maybe a fixer. Either way, he didn't belong alone on a dead warehouse lot in the middle of the day. I kept low behind the concrete edge and watched him stop at a side gate I hadn't seen from the road. He punched in a code, went through, and didn't look back. That gate led to a service yard I could only see by leaning around the slab. Small trailer, chain link cage, portable generator, and a second vehicle tucked under a tarp, nose pointed toward the alley. The kind of setup you use when you want to move papers, tools, or people without drawing attention. My radio clicked once in my pocket, dead quiet. No call, no voice, just a little burst of static. Then the man in the vest came back out, carrying a flat brown envelope under his arm. Not empty, heavy. He slid it into the van, climbed in, and before he shut the door I saw the edge of a stamp pad on the passenger seat. Red ink, city seal. I knew that seal. It was Pike's. And just as the van started rolling, my phone lit up with an unknown number, and the screen showed one word before I could answer. Nolan. I didn't answer the call in the open lot. I watched the van pull out first, let it get 2 turns down the service road, and only then I put the phone to my ear and moved into the shadow of the concrete wall. For a second, there was nothing, just breath, close, controlled, almost amused. Then a man said, "You keep looking at the wrong corners, Captain." No name, no introduction. He knew who I was anyway. I stayed still and listened while the street noise rubbed against the line. A truck shifting gears, a gull screaming over the docks. The little electrical hiss that means a cheap burner is sitting in somebody's glove box. The voice went on. "The depots are done. Let it go." I said, "Who is this?" A soft click. Then, instead of an answer, a photo came through. Not on a fancy app, plain text message. Grainy shot of a warehouse keyring on a nail board with one tag circled in red. Vale Site Services. Under it, one line. Intake yard. I stared at that for a half second too long. That was the first real map they'd left me. The intake yard sat on the edge of the old waterworks, half fenced, half abandoned, with a chain-link panel bent inward where a truck had kissed it too hard. I got there 20 minutes later, staying off the main roads and killing my headlights a block short. The place smelled like wet earth, machine oil, and rusted pipe. No birds, no wind. Just that hollow, quiet industrial sites get when the work is gone home and only the bones are left. There were fresh tire marks in the gravel. Same tread depth, same turn radius, a delivery van or a light utility truck making careful runs in and out. I crouched by the gate and found a smear of pale plaster on the lockbox. Drywall dust. Again. The same kind I'd seen at the burned depot, the same dust on the boots of the man with the clipboard. That was enough for me. These people weren't just using warehouse fires. They were moving through the city's supply chain like it belonged to them. Inside the yard, one of the old pump houses still had power. A pale strip light buzzed above the door, and through the grimy window I saw racks of rolled hose, brass fittings, and a stack of municipal forms in a plastic tray. Not a public office, a staging point, a place where shutoffs, inspections, and cleanup jobs could all be pushed through without anyone asking why a private company had access to city water gear. That's the trick with a racket like this. It doesn't look criminal from 10 feet away. It looks administrative. I slipped along the side wall and heard voices through the vent louver. 2 men. One of them was Pike, easy to place now that I knew the tone. The other had a deeper voice, clipped and nervous, the kind you get from a man who's used to taking orders and hates every second of it. "We had one problem," the nervous one said. "The old firefighter won't stop." "He's a pension case," Pike answered. "He wants a story." "Give him a story." A chair scraped, then Pike again. "The next side is already signed. No hydrants, no witnesses, and the inspector packet goes in before dawn. The developer wants the lot clean by next week." I leaned closer to the wall, one hand flat against the cold brick. The words landed like nails. Next site. Signed. Before dawn. The machine hadn't slowed down at all. It had just shifted gears. Then the vent rattled. Not from inside, from the yard. I turned just in time to see the utility van I'd tailed earlier easing back through the gate with its lights off. It stopped beside the pump house, and the driver stepped out carrying a brown envelope and a long metal case. He wasn't alone this time. A second man got out from the passenger side, broad as a door, with a hard hat low over his eyes and a radio clipped to his belt. He looked straight at the wall where I was standing, and smiled. I didn't let the phone ring twice. I was already moving before the second buzz, slipping back along the slab edge and keeping the concrete between me and the intake yard gate. If that message had Nolan's name on it, then somebody wanted me looking at the screen, not the road. The van was still there. The broad man in the hard hat had stopped smiling and gone rigid, watching the pump house window like he expected me to walk out of it. I kept my head down, thumbed the message open, and found a single line from an unknown number. "Come alone." Then another line dropped in right after it, this one with a time and a dock number I knew from the old waterfront maps. No apology, no explanation, just a meeting point. That was enough to tell me they had decided I was worth talking to. I crossed the yard low and fast, staying in the dark seam between the wall and the stacked pipe. The old pump house gave off a warm electrical smell through the vent slots. Inside, Pike's voice had gone quiet. The nervous one was still there, but he was speaking in shorter pieces now, clipped and dry. They had heard the van come back around. They knew somebody had spooked the package. That meant my face was probably already on a phone somewhere. I didn't have the luxury of waiting them out. I wanted the man in the hard hat, the envelope, and whatever was in that metal case. That was the nearest thing to a trail I had. The gate on the side yard opened into a strip of cracked pavement and a row of stacked pallets wrapped in black plastic. I moved behind them just as the broad man stepped out of the van. Up close, he had the kind of neck that comes from years of hauling or breaking things. One hand stayed near his radio. The other carried the metal case by the handle, careful, almost tender. The case clinked once when he set it down on a workbench beside the trailer. Tools, or parts, or something they didn't want bouncing around. Then Pike came out of the pump house. He didn't look like a man doing field work. He looked like an office man in a field jacket, clean cuffs, polished boots, shirt collar still straight under the coat. That mismatch always gets me. Men like that never carry dirt unless they brought it with them. He took the brown envelope from the van, split the flap with a thumb, and checked the contents without opening it all the way. Papers. I could see corners, signatures. One page had a red stamp already pressed on the top margin. The yard went still except for the buzz from the light over the pump house door. Then I heard the broad man say, "He's here." Not loud, not panicked. Just matter of fact, like he was reporting a tool check. Pike's head turned a fraction, not toward the road, but toward the pipe stack where I was hidden. Not a full look, just enough. He knew the angle, knew the cover, knew I was in the line of sight, even if he couldn't see my face yet. So much for surprise. I backed deeper into the shadow and let the shape of the place settle in my head. The yard had one exit wide enough for a truck, one side gate, and the pump house at the center like a weak heart. The pipes were stacked in a way that would make a decent barrier if they came at me fast, but the pallets would burn hot and fast if somebody hit them with a flare. I could smell old oil on the wood. Somebody had been sloppy, or they'd wanted it that way. Either way, this place could go up in a backdraft if a spark found the wrong pocket. That thought gave me a choice, not whether to fight. I was already there. The choice was whether to let them keep the papers. I slid one hand down to the old utility knife in my belt, stepped around the pallet stack, and flicked a metal wrench off the nearest workbench. It struck the concrete hard, not enough to matter by itself. But it made the broad man jerk his head, and in that half second, I saw what Pike had in the envelope. A city seal, and beneath it, my own name, typed on a witness sheet I had never signed. Pike looked up from the page as if he had felt the air change. "Captain Reed," he said, soft as a warning shot, "you keep showing up where you're not invited." I didn't answer. I was already staring at the metal case because it had just opened a crack when he set it down, and inside I saw brass fittings, a roll of wire, and the top edge of a dry standpipe nozzle wrapped in cloth. The broad man noticed me looking at it at the exact same time I did. His hand went to the case, and Pike smiled like the trap had just finished closing. I didn't wait for the laugh to finish. The broad man's hand was just starting to close on the metal case when I stepped out of cover and drove my shoulder into the pallet stack. Wood cracked, plastic wraps snapped. One whole row of wrapped pipe lurched sideways and thundered down between us, not crushing anybody, but breaking the line clean in half. That was all I needed. Pike jerked back. The broad man swore and went for his radio. I went low and hard toward the workbench because I'd seen the angle on the case and knew the moment his hand came off it, I'd lose the only thing in the yard worth taking. Pike barked something I didn't catch. The broad man reached for me instead, fast and ugly, the way paid muscle always moves when the talking stops. I caught his wrist with my left hand, turned it just enough to ruin the joint, and slammed the heel of my right palm into his throat. A message. He staggered back, gagging, one hand clawing at his collar, the other dropping the case. The case hit the concrete and popped open. Inside were not tools, not really. Brass nozzle parts, yes, but also a wad of shortened wire, a pair of cut seals, and a laminated inspection sheet already filled out with my name in the witness line. The ink was fresh enough to shine. That hit harder than the fist I'd been ready to use. Pike saw my face change. He knew exactly why. "You can still walk away," he said. "No," I told him. He took one step back toward the pump house, and I saw him glance at the open doorway. That was when I knew he had people inside with him. He wasn't standing there to negotiate. He was stalling me until the other pair came around the back. The broad man came again, one hand over his throat, the other swinging a short tire iron from his belt. I ducked the first arc and hit him with the edge of my forearm under the jaw. His teeth snapped shut so hard, I heard it. He dropped to one knee, but he still wasn't done. Men like that never are until their body quits on them. Behind me, the pump house door slammed open. Two more shapes came out at a run. One carried a flashlight. The other had the kind of square weight under his jacket that makes you think handgun before you even see it. The light hit my face, white and hot, and for a split second the whole yard turned into a flat sheet of glare and shadow. I saw Pike duck into the pump house, envelope under his arm, moving fast now. So much for the clean office man. I grabbed the broad man by the back of the vest and threw him across the corner of the workbench. He went down hard, knocked the lamp out, and the yard went half dark. That bought me a breath. Not enough. Just enough. The first new man charged in blind, and I took him with the wrench hand off the bench, driving the metal across his knuckles. He yelled and dropped the light. The beam rolled across the gravel and stopped on the open case, where the laminated sheet flashed again. My own name, my own signature block. That was the trick. That was what they wanted if I backed off. A paper trail that would turn me from witness to liability. The second man was smarter. He didn't rush. He drew that square weight from under his jacket and aimed it at my chest through the dark. "Back up," he said. I could hear Pike moving inside the pump house. Paper rustle, fast feet, and under that the faint metallic clack of a door being opened somewhere deeper in the building. The shot cracked once. It hit the bench beside my head and exploded a shower of splinters into my cheek. Hot wood bit my skin. I dropped flat behind the workbench, rolled, and came up on the other side where the dead light lay blinking in the gravel. The man with the gun had shifted his feet to track me, but he hadn't counted on the pipes stacked against the wall. I kicked the lowest bundle of pipe clips loose. The whole stack shuddered and slid. Metal rolled, slammed, and tore along the pavement in a chain of shrieks. Not enough to bury him, but enough to make him jump back. One of the pipes clipped his shin. He went off balance. I lunged in, got both hands on his gun wrist, and drove him into the side of the van until the breath left his body in one hard grunt. Then the pump house lights died. The yard went black for a beat, absolute black, and in that dark, I heard Pike's voice from somewhere inside the building, low and furious, shouting at someone I couldn't see. Not because he was losing, because he'd expected this to go cleaner. When the emergency strip light kicked on above the pump house door, it washed the yard in a weak red glow. Pike was gone from the doorway, and on the concrete where he had been standing, right at the threshold, there was a fresh trail of wet footprints leading deeper inside, toward the back room with no windows. I followed the wet footprints through the pump house without hurrying. That's how you stay alive in a place that wants you loud and careless. The red strip light over the door gave the room a weak, bleeding glow. On the floor, the tracks were still fresh, dark against the dust, leading past a stack of spare hose couplings and into a back room with no windows. The broad man I'd dropped was still groaning outside. The other two were somewhere in the yard, but inside the building, it had gone too quiet. That kind of quiet is never empty. It's waiting. The back room had a steel filing cabinet bolted to the wall, a folding table, and a dry erase board with a rough map of the waterfront drawn in black marker. No office clutter, no lunchbox, no personal junk, just work. I cut the power to the room by pulling the breaker off the panel, then stood there in the dark for a second with my palm on the file cabinet and listened. Nothing but the low buzz from the emergency strip outside and the tiny rattle of something metal cooling in the wall. When I yanked the cabinet open, the top drawer held what I'd been hunting for since the first depot. Signed shut-off orders, temporary water diversion sheets, inspection stickers pre-filled in Pike's handwriting. One folder had the city seal on the cover and a delivery route marked in orange grease pencil. Not random routes. The same dockside blocks, over and over, drawn in a line that ended at a redevelopment parcel under the developer's holding company. This wasn't just a dirty inspector. This was logistics. The whole thing was planned like a supply run. I heard Pike before I saw him. A phone call, low and tight, coming from the other side of the wall. "Then move the next one up," he said. "I don't care about the old man. The lot has to clear before the auction window closes." I paused with the folder in my hand. Next one. So there was another burn already set in motion, probably already insured, probably already condemned on paper, probably already paid for in somebody's head. The same machine, just another gear. I slipped the folder under my coat and crossed to the dry erase board. The map had 3 circles on it, each one tied to a different service corridor. One of them was the old canning warehouse by the canal. Another was a storage block near the rail spur. The third had a note beside it that made my jaw tighten. Night shift, roof access, PO on site. PO meant point of origin. Pike had labeled the place the way an investigator would after the fact. That told me he wasn't just helping the fires along. He was authorizing the scene before the flame ever touched the walls. I took a photo of the board with my phone, then another of the water shut-off sheets, because if the city wanted to pretend this was bad wiring, I was going to hand them a stack of paper they couldn't swallow whole. A floorboard creaked outside the room. I killed the flashlight and held still. The door handle moved once, slow. Then again. Whoever stood there didn't rush. That worried me more than the broad man with the tire iron. Smart people don't kick doors unless they have to. They listen first, and the person on the other side of that door was listening right now. My phone vibrated once in my pocket, dead quiet against my ribs. Another message. No sound, no call, just a single picture loading on the screen from the same unknown number. It was Nolan's work helmet, sitting on a table under a bare bulb, and behind it, half out of frame, Pike's hand holding the edge of a fresh matchbook. I didn't stare at the picture for long. Nolan's helmet, Pike's hand, the matchbook edge. That was the kind of message they sent when they wanted you angry and sloppy. So I locked the screen, slid the phone into my coat, and moved away from the door instead of toward it. The back room had one narrow vent running above the filing cabinet, and the old dry standpipe rose through the far corner like a dead metal tree. I stayed in the shadow of both. The handle turned again on the other side of the door, slower this time, testing it. Whoever was there had patience. That meant he wasn't the broad man from the yard. This one had come to check the room, not kick it in. I crouched by the cabinet and worked the folders open one-handed, keeping my body tucked low. The papers inside were better than I'd hoped. Site shutoffs, temporary bypass orders, a list of warehouse addresses with little ink marks beside 3 of them. One mark was a full circle, one was a slash. The third had a date and a time window next to it. Same handwriting as Pike's sheets, same ugly confidence. Tonight. That single word sat in my head like a live round. The next burn was already set. Not maybe, not pending. Set. I put the papers back in place, then heard the door edge scrape the frame. Slow entry, no rush. I killed the strip light with a slap, and the room dropped into a red-black half-dark, broken only by the small wash from the hall. The handle moved once more. Then the door cracked open enough for a shoulder. A man came in with a flashlight held chest high, beam angled down so it wouldn't blind him if somebody was waiting. Smart. He swept the room once, paused at the cabinet, and took a step in. I waited until he crossed the threshold. Then I moved. I came up from the side, drove my forearm across the back of his neck, and pinned the flashlight hand against the wall before he could raise it. The light burst across the ceiling and spun in his grip. He shoved back hard, trying to turn into me, but I'd already hooked his elbow and twisted. The joint popped. Not clean, just enough. He gasped once, a sharp little sound, and I slammed him face first into the filing cabinet. His radio hit the floor and cracked open. The man was younger than Pike, thicker through the shoulders, with a square jaw and a cheap tactical jacket. Not yard muscle, courier muscle, the kind that thinks uniforms make them invisible. I held him there with my forearm under his throat and reached into his jacket pocket. Keys, a folded route slip, and a plastic badge holder with a magnetic card inside. The route slip had the same dockside blocks, but this one was marked with a service gate code and a warehouse name I'd seen on the map board, the Canning Block by the canal. The badge card had a company logo on it and a line of tiny print that made my stomach go hard. Access valid for inspection team and subcontracted water crews. That was the whole trick in one sentence. They didn't break in. They walked in with permission. The man thrashed once more, and I leaned closer. "Who else is in the yard?" I asked. He spat blood at the floor instead of answering. I tightened the arm for 2 seconds, not enough to drop him, enough to remind him what air costs. His eyes watered, and he tried to pull a breath through the pressure. Finally, he said, "Pike's gone." "Where?" He shook his head against the cabinet, the edges of the papers rattling under his cheek. "Didn't say." I let him breathe, because a panicked man talks better when he can feel his lungs again. "What's tonight?" His mouth tightened, then he gave up a little. "The canal block, old storage wing. It's supposed to go before dawn." "Supposed to?" He swallowed. "Weather's bad. Wind's coming up." That made the back of my neck prickle. Wind and old timber, tight alleyways, dry roof cavities. The wrong gust can turn a clean burn into a knife fight. Pike knew that, which meant tonight wasn't just a fire. It was a move. Outside, something heavy rolled across the concrete. The broad man from the yard, maybe, or the other one circling back. The courier felt it too. His eyes flicked toward the hall, and I saw the fear come up fast. Real fast. I shoved him away from me and snatched the route slip off the floor before he could step backward into the door. He stumbled out into the red strip light, clutching his neck, and I heard him call out once into the yard. Not a name, just a sharp, warning bark. Then from somewhere deeper inside the pump house, Pike's voice came over a radio speaker, cold and even. "Check the office, then burn the paper." I looked at the back room floor and saw, half hidden under the cabinet, a second folder I hadn't noticed before. The tab was handwritten in red ink. Nolan Reed. My hand went still on the edge of it. I closed my fingers on the folder and pulled it free. The paper inside wasn't old. The edges were sharp, the kind that cut your thumb if you rush it. Nolan's full name sat on the top sheet, then a chain of dates, signatures, and a short incident note that never happened the way they wrote it. Reprimanded for insubordination, assigned to the canal block, cleared for rooftop access. That last line hit me hardest, because I knew, right there and then, that somebody had put my kid on a roof they planned to burn out from under him, as a schedule. I flipped the page and found a copy of the night work order. Same orange grease pencil I'd seen before, same clean route marks. The box beside the canal warehouse was circled twice, then underlined, then circled again, as if Pike wanted even the paper to understand the order of the work. Under that, in smaller print, was a note about wind shift and roof voids. He was writing the fire the way a butcher writes a cut. He knew where it would run, where it would choke, and where it would break open if the air changed. That was the part that made my stomach go hard. The control. I heard the door handle move again, then stop. Somebody outside was waiting for the right moment to come through. The room had a dry standpipe in the corner, old white paint flaking off the cap, and I moved to it without thinking. The access panel beside it was half loose. Firehouses and waterworks share the same bones, and once you know where the service chases run, the walls stop being walls. I popped the panel open with my knife and looked through the gap. A narrow utility passage ran behind the wall, just wide enough for a man to crawl if he didn't mind getting scraped raw. Dust, old pipe scale, mouse droppings, the stale metallic smell of dead water lines. I shoved the folder under my jacket, slipped into the passage, and pulled the panel back until it sat nearly flush. The hallway outside the room went red with the strip light again, then dimmed as someone covered the doorway. I eased forward on my elbows and knees, slow as a rat in a culvert. From that slit of space, I could see into the pump house through the glass in the far wall. Pike had returned. He was standing by the board with the waterfront map, one hand on a phone, the other tapping the route slip against his leg. The broad man was back on his feet too, one shoulder hanging low now, and the courier had his head down over the open metal case. Pike said, "If the captain's got the file, then he's already in the game." A voice on the phone answered, too faint to make out all of it. Then Pike said, "No, the next one stays. The auction window doesn't move." I stopped crawling. Auction window. That was new. Not a fire for its own sake then. A fire to clear property before paperwork locked the value in place. The developer wasn't just buying land after the fact. He was timing the burns to the sale. The courier lifted something from the case, and I caught a flash of brass in the red light. A nozzle assembly. Not a whole tool set, a piece of one. Pike took it, set it down on the map board, and used it like a marker. The canning warehouse sat right under his hand. Tonight. No wonder they wanted me out of the yard. No wonder they'd sent the picture of Nolan's helmet. They weren't warning me. They were trying to keep me busy while the next fire got fed. I backed out of the passage and came up through a service hatch near the loading side of the building. The air outside had gone colder. A truck was idling somewhere beyond the fence, and the smell of diesel cut through the wet concrete stank. I kept low, crossed behind the stacked pipe, and reached the side gate just as the broad man limped past the van with a fresh roll of fencing wire in his hand. He didn't see me. Pike did, for half a second, but by then I had already moved into the shadow of the gate post. The route slip was clenched in my fist, the badge card too, and as I looked down at the last folder under my coat, I saw there was another tab behind Nolan's. My own name was on it. Damian Reed. I tore the tab on the second folder and opened it with my thumb still on the gatepost. Inside were copies of my own duty roster, my home address, the route I took to and from the station, and a little stack of notes written in the same neat block as Pike's forms. No grand speech, no threat letter, just timing, habit, and places I could be reached. The kind of file you make when you want a man predictable before you make him scared. There was even a photo of my truck parked outside the station, taken from across the street at dawn. On the back, somebody had penciled a single line. "He won't stop looking." That told me one thing plain as daylight. They weren't just covering fires anymore. They were watching me, like a problem that needed solving. I folded the sheet, tucked it under my coat, and crossed to the van. The broad man was busy wrestling fresh fencing wire off the tailgate with his good arm. Pike was inside the pump house, still on the move, and the courier I'd dropped was nowhere in sight. The yard had gone quiet again except for the hum of the strip light and the wet drip from the gutter. I used that quiet to take the badge card from my pocket and study it one more time. Valid for inspection team and subcontracted water crews. That was my pass. The canal warehouse sat 2 blocks east, where the brick street bent toward the water. I got there on foot, cutting through service lanes and keeping off the main road. The closer I came, the more I could smell it. Not smoke yet. Fuel, old timber, warm tar paper. A building doesn't have to burn before it starts talking. This one was already whispering. The loading bay door was half open, and inside I could see stacked pallets wrapped in plastic, a forklift parked nose first against the wall, and 2 orange fuel drums set beside a marked spill tray like somebody had arranged a dinner table for trouble. I flashed the badge at the side gate, and the lock released with a tired click. No one stopped me. That was the ugly part. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, with a faint chemical bite riding under the warehouse dust. The roof trusses were blackened in patches from some old, small fire that had never been fully reported. I could see where somebody had tied off the alarm loop and run it through a cheap bypass box. Clean work, but sloppy enough for a man who thought paperwork was the only battlefield that mattered. The space was built to burn fast if they wanted it to. Fuel near the center, open roof voids, propped vents above the west wall, a long aisle that would pull flame forward if a draft came through the loading bay. Backdraft country. I stayed close to the shadow line and moved up the left wall. At the far end, under a hanging work light, Pike was talking to the man in the hard hat from the yard. The same one who had smiled at me. His shoulder still hung low from the cabinet slam, but he was standing. On the floor between them sat another case, opened this time, with a stack of municipal forms inside and a roll of red inspection seals beside it. Pike had the route slip in one hand and a phone in the other. "The wind will push through the roof," he said. "We don't need a full soak, just enough to make the scorch geometry ugly." I stopped behind a pallet stack and watched him point at the north wall with 2 fingers. He wasn't guessing. He knew the building, knew where the heat would gather, where the draft would run, where the flame would bite first. A man like that doesn't just sign the papers. He helps choose the shape of the ruin. The hard hat man turned, and I saw he was carrying a small roll of wire mesh and a couple of fresh latch pins, not tools for repair, tools for trapping doors, open or shut. He crouched to fasten one onto the loading bay track, then glanced toward the ceiling like he was measuring where the smoke would collect. My radio, dead on my belt, gave a tiny crackle. Then the warehouse speaker above the office door hissed to life. A man's voice came through it, thin and cold, and I knew before the second word who it was. "He's in the building," Pike said. I froze in the loading bay and listened to Pike's voice roll over the warehouse speaker again, thin and metallic, like it had been dragged through a pipe. That one line told me enough. He wasn't guessing where I was. He was already directing the search. The air had that sweet chemical bite I'd learned to hate years ago, the kind that rides ahead of flame and makes your eyes water before the heat even shows up. Fuel drums, dust, old timber, fresh plastic wrap. The place was built to burn fast if somebody gave it a spark, and Pike knew every weak line in the bones of the building. I kept low behind the pallets, looked up at the roof trusses, and read the shape of the trap before I moved another inch. If they lit the bay with the vents shut, the whole front half would flash hard and ugly. If they let it breathe first, the fire would race the aisle and pin me under the mezzanine. Either way, it was a bad room. Not for me, for them. I slipped behind a stack of wrapped lumber and found the access ladder to the office catwalk. Rung by rung, hand over hand, I climbed in the dark, while the hard hat man's boots crossed the concrete below. He was searching the floor level now, slow and methodical, calling once for Pike and getting nothing back. Pike had already moved off, probably toward the office or the rear service corridor. That told me he wanted distance between himself and whatever was about to happen. Smart. Coward smart. Up on the catwalk, the warehouse opened under me like a gutted machine. The ceiling fans were still, but the heat trapped near the rafters had started to collect in dirty layers. I could see the scorch geometry already in the arrangement of the drums and the open spill tray. A thief's. Somebody had staged the scene so the first investigation would point at the wrong failure, and the second one would arrive too late to matter. On the desk in the office, the red glow of a monitor lit a stack of folders and a half-empty coffee cup. Pike had left in a hurry. That was the first real mistake he'd made. I crossed the catwalk and eased into the office through a door that hadn't latched all the way. Inside, the room smelled like paper dust, old toner, and warm electronics. A wall map was pinned with colored tabs, and every tab was a property I knew from the folders. Burn Depot, Canal Block. One tab had my own street number written beside it in black marker. Under that, a note, after next sale. I read it twice before it sank in. He wasn't just threatening me, he'd marked my house for after the next auction window. When the developer's land deal cleared, my place would be a loose end to tidy up. There was a laptop on the desk still logged in, and the screen showed a checklist with 3 columns: shut off, inspection, ignition. That was the machine in plain clothes. Every blaze had a cleanup order before the match. Every report had the stamp before the smoke. The last item on the checklist was tonight's warehouse, and under it Pike had typed one more line in all caps: keep the bay sealed until the backdraft is ready. My mouth went dry. Down below, something metal struck concrete. Once, then again. The broad man was still hunting, and now he was close enough that I could hear his breathing over the hum of the lights. I shut the laptop and took the top folder from the desk. Inside were copies of the next sale agreement, the developer's shell company, and a signed access sheet for one more building I hadn't seen yet. Same owner, same stamp, same dates. But what stopped me cold was the final page tucked behind the others. It was my truck route, my exact route, annotated with times. I looked up just as the office door handle moved from the outside. Slowly, no rush. Somebody was trying to come in quiet, and under that soft click of metal, from somewhere in the warehouse below, Pike's voice came back on the speaker, calm as ever. Check the office. He'll be there, unless he's already on the catwalk. The handle stopped before it fully turned. That told me whoever was outside had heard the speaker too, or the floor under my feet, or just the bad kind of silence that settles right before a body moves. I backed one step off the catwalk door and flattened myself against the office wall. The room was tight enough that I could smell the dust warming under the monitor and the stale coffee Pike had left behind. Through the glass panel, I could see the warehouse floor below in red emergency light, the hard hat man still circling by the loading bay, and the first wave of fear starting to change his posture. He wasn't hunting anymore. He was waiting to be told where to look. The door opened a handspan. I let it. A shoulder came through first, then a face with a cheap beard and a flashlight. Not Pike, one of the yard men. He pushed in just far enough to sweep the room, and I came off the wall with a short, hard drive into his ribs. The air punched out of him in one ugly cough. I hooked his wrist before the flashlight could rise and jammed his own elbow into the door frame until it bent his balance sideways. He dropped the light, and before it hit the carpet, I'd already taken the radio from his belt and pinned him by the throat against the filing cabinet. "Where's Pike?" I asked. He tried to twist free. Bad choice. I tightened my forearm until his eyes watered, and he nodded toward the office speaker with a little jerk of his chin. That was all I needed. Pike was still on the line, still running the board from somewhere safe. I stripped the man's jacket pocket. There was a folded site map, a brass key, and a tiny plastic tag stamped Canal Storage, Rear, the same warehouse from the checklist. I held the tag under the red light and something cold moved through me. That was the next door, the next room, the next body count if I let them keep steering. Then I heard Pike again, not through the speaker this time, but from the office phone on the desk. His voice came in clipped and sharp, speaking to somebody with money in it. "No, the captain's not the problem," he said. "He's only one man. We burn the canal block, we close the loop, and the developer signs before the inspectors ever get involved." There it was, the line he'd been guarding all along. Not just one arson crew, not just one dirty inspection. A loop. Fires feeding sales, sales feeding payoffs, payoffs feeding the next fire. The whole thing was a wheel, and I was standing in the spokes. I shoved the yard man into the chair, tied his wrists with his own radio strap, and crossed to the desk. Pike had left the laptop open because he thought he was already out of reach. That mistake cost him. On the screen was the same checklist as before, only now the canal warehouse had been updated with a second note. Windows sealed, bay doors chained, roof vent locked until arrival. Until arrival of who? That was the question. Pike or the developer? Maybe both. I pulled the top drawer and found the answer folded under a stack of blank forms. A transportation invoice. Midnight delivery. 2 pallets of accelerant drums. 1 pallet of signage. 1 sealed envelope for a notary. And attached to the back of the page was a handwritten note in the same block print I'd seen all week. If he comes alone, use the office door. I laughed once. No humor in it. They'd been planning my route better than I had. The sound of a truck engine rolled outside the warehouse, low and heavy, then cut off. Headlights washed the cracks beneath the office blinds. Someone else had arrived at the yard. I moved to the window and looked down just in time to see Pike climbing out of a dark sedan at the far gate, coat flaring in the wind, phone pressed to his ear. He looked up, straight at the office. And in the red wash from the emergency light, he gave me the smallest possible nod, like we'd both just reached the same line in the script. I had one hand on the office door and the other on Pike's file when the whole place shifted from tense to dangerous. Outside, the sedan door slammed. Below me, the hard-hat man shouted once, short and sharp, and a second voice answered from the yard. Not a question, a response. That meant Pike had brought more than his little work crew. My truck route was on the desk, my house was in their papers, and now the warehouse had a second set of feet moving around it. They were tightening the net. I dropped flat behind the desk, just as the door came open hard enough to rattle the frame. A flashlight blade cut across the office, hit the monitor, and flared back. I kept still and let the beam sweep past. The man at the door didn't step in all the way, smart enough to clear the room from the threshold, not smart enough to check the dead angle behind the filing cabinet. He said, "Nothing in here." Wrong. I slid the desk lamp toward the edge with 2 fingers. The cord stretched, the base tipped, and the lamp crashed to the floor on the far side of the room. The man jerked his head toward the sound without thinking. That was all I needed. I came up low, drove the folder into his wrist to turn the flashlight aside, and slammed my knee into the back of his leg. He buckled with a grunt and pitched into the doorway. I caught the back of his jacket, dragged him in just enough to shut the others out, and kicked the door half closed behind him. He fought like a man who knew he had backup. Short elbows, hard shoulders, no wasted panic. I jammed him against the wall, took the weight off his feet, and clipped the side of his head with the heel of my palm. Not enough to drop him, enough to make the noise in his skull louder than the noise outside. Then I heard Pike call from below. "Check the office. He's inside somewhere." So he knew. Of course he knew. I twisted the man's arm behind him, dragged him to the desk, and shoved his face over the open file. "Read," I said. "You signed on this?" He didn't answer, but his eyes fell to the papers anyway. My roster, my route, my home address, the note about the house. For 1 second his face changed. Not guilt, fear. He'd seen the line and understood what kind of work he was standing in. The answer came from the yard, a heavy bang against metal. Then another. Someone had started forcing the side gate. The trap was no longer quiet. I snatched the brass key and the rear access card from the man's pocket, then hauled him to the office window and shoved him down into the shadow beneath it. "Stay there," I told him. "If you move, I break the other arm." He believed me. Good. I climbed the catwalk door and looked down over the warehouse. Pike had crossed to the loading bay, coat collar up, phone still at his ear. The hard hat man was at the truck now, pulling something long and narrow from the bed. Not a tool bag, a rolled package. Signage, maybe, or a banner, something to hang over a door. The yard noise had grown louder, boots and hinges and a truck engine idling too high. Then I smelled it. Fuel. fresh and sharp, not the old warehouse stink, but spilled on purpose. I looked toward the loading bay and saw the hard hat man kneeling by the orange drums, working fast with the wire mesh and latch pins I'd seen earlier. He was chaining the bay doors into a fixed gap, not sealing them shut, setting them to breathe wrong. Pike wanted a slow pull of air through the front and a trapped pocket above the loading lane. He was building the fire to flash and then run, just like the notes on his laptop. Backdraft. That was the word my head put to it, cold and immediate. I moved off the catwalk and crossed to the office monitor because the screen was still on and the map board was mirrored in the glass. There, in the bottom corner, a second timestamp blinked next to tonight's warehouse. Not midnight, 10 minutes from now. 10 minutes. I grabbed the phone off Pike's desk and hit the yard number from the checklist. It rang twice before a man answered, breathing hard. I didn't say hello. I said, "Bay doors are wrong. Get clear." The line went silent for half a beat. Then Pike's voice snapped in from somewhere else on the speaker system, not to me, to his own people. "Ignore that. That's him talking." So he could hear me. Good. Let him. I killed the call, stepped back into the office doorway, and watched Pike turn his head toward the catwalk window. He had a face like a man trying to decide whether to smile or strike. In the red spill of the emergency light, he lifted one finger, just one, and pointed up at me. Then the warehouse speaker crackled again, and his voice came through, calm as a shovel hitting dirt. "Captain Reed," he said, "if you're up there, you've got about 90 seconds before the roof starts talking." I slid the folder under my coat and moved for the service wall instead of the door. That wall had a narrow maintenance cutout behind the office shelves, the kind nobody thinks about until they need to run pipe or cable through it. The opening led into a dead service chase lined with dust, pipe scale, and old insulation that smelled like wet cardboard. I shoved the panel loose with 2 fingers and slipped inside on my knees, keeping one hand on the folder and the other on the rough brick. The office behind me went quiet, but below the warehouse floor, I could still hear Pike talking over the speaker, calm enough to make my teeth itch. He wasn't talking to the yard man anymore. He was talking to somebody with money. The chase bent down behind the dry standpipe, and that was the first thing that told me the building had been prepared by people who thought they were clever. A dry standpipe should be empty until the fire department feeds it. This one had been left clean, capped, and routed straight through the wall to a hatch above the loading lane. Whoever had done the work knew exactly where a firefighter would look if he was forced inside and looking for another way out. That's what made my stomach tighten. They weren't guessing the room. They were writing it. I crawled to the hatch, eased the cover up, and peered through the slit. Below me, the loading bay looked dressed for a funeral. 2 orange drums sat by the spill tray. The wire mesh was already clipped in place to hold the door at the wrong angle. The hard hat man moved fast, head down, setting latch pins and checking the chain like he was setting a trap for deer. The fuel smell was stronger now, sharp enough to sit at the back of the throat. It had the same sweet chemical bite as the depots, the same accelerant signature hiding under warehouse dust and tar. Pike had the same smile on his voice, too. I could hear him in the office speaker saying, "Once he sees the bay, he'll think he's got time." No, he'd think he had time. I knew better. I worked the hatch open wider and dropped into the standpipe chase, then out through the lower access into the service lane behind the loading wall. The metal ladder had cold rungs and greasy well seams, and the whole climb down smelled like old rain trapped in pipe joints. At the bottom, I landed soft, rolled once, and came up behind a stack of broken pallets. The bay was only a few feet away now, close enough that I could hear the little clicks of the hard hat man's hands on the latch pins. I waited until he turned. Then I stepped out and drove him backward with the flat of my forearm into the mesh roll. He hit hard, knocked the breath out of himself, and dropped the wire cutters. Pike shouted something from the yard. The hard hat man swung wild, but I already had his wrist and turned it until the joint gave a dull, ugly pop. He folded with a strangled noise, and I took the cutters from the floor. I used them on the nearest latch pin to ruin the angle. The bay door would still move, but it wouldn't seal the way Pike wanted. That was all I needed. If he lit the drums now, the draft wouldn't pull clean across the front. It would break sideways and buy me a few extra heartbeats before the whole bay flashed ugly. Fire is a machine. You don't have to stop every gear. Sometimes you just need to jam one tooth. Then I heard tires crunch on gravel outside. A second sedan had come through the gate. Pike went quiet on the speaker for the first time all night. That alone told me the driver mattered. I moved up to the gap beside the loading door and looked out through the side lattice. The yard light washed the gravel white. Pike stood near the gate in his clean coat, one hand still on his phone, and beside the rear sedan, a man in a dark raincoat stepped out with dry shoes and a face that didn't belong in a warehouse yard. Pike lowered his head as the man approached, and when the light caught the lapel pin on the raincoat, I knew exactly who had just arrived to watch the fire. Grant Vail. I held my breath and watched Grant Vail come to a stop under the yard light like he owned the gravel beneath his shoes. He wasn't dressed like a man who had just crossed a warehouse yard at night. No dust on the cuffs, no wet stains on the hems, no ash on the soles. Clean raincoat, dry leather, polished calm. Pike stepped to him with his shoulders a little too square, the way a middleman stands when the boss is in range. The hard-hat man hung back by the gate, still rubbing his wrist where I'd cranked it earlier. Pike handed Vail a folder, and Vail didn't open it right away. He just felt its weight, nodded once, and said something I couldn't catch over the hum of the yard lamp. Then Pike answered, "The canal block is ready. The inspector signed this afternoon." That was all I needed. Grant Vail wasn't there to ask questions. He was there to see whether the paperwork and the fire were still moving in the same direction. I watched Pike spread the bay plan out over the hood of the sedan. He pointed at the loading door, then at the roof line, then at the service lane behind the building. Vail leaned over the paper with one hand in his pocket, and I saw the edge of a second folder tucked under his arm, a transfer packet. Title pages by the look of the tab. If the warehouse burned right, the land would change hands before morning, and the lot would be clean before the first engine ever wrote a report. The ugly part? They had set the room to make sure of it. The mesh on the bay door would choke the draft, not stop it. The orange drums sat exactly where flame would race through a spill tray and bite back under the loading overhang. And the sealed gaps Pike had wired into the frame meant the warehouse would breathe wrong the moment the heat climbed. A managed one. The kind you can shape if you know the air and don't care who gets buried under it. I moved off the office window and dropped into the maintenance chase behind the wall. Dust scraped my knuckles. Old pipe scale came loose under my palm. The chase ran behind a dead, dry standpipe and down toward the loading lane, which meant I could cross the building without showing myself in the yard. Good. I wanted the file first, evidence. The folder under my coat felt heavier every time I touched it, like it knew what it was carrying. Halfway down the chase, I heard Vail's voice carry through the open office speaker. "If Reed's on site, then this changes," he said. Pike answered too fast. "It doesn't change anything. It changes the timeline." Timeline, that word again. Not a fire, a schedule. I found the lower panel and slipped through into the loading lane behind a stack of broken pallets. The air there was hotter, sour with fuel and plastic wrap and the stale breath of old timber. The hard-hat man had gone to the left side gate, where a white utility pickup idled with its brake lights on. Two men in municipal jackets stood beside it, one carrying a sealed can and the other a roll of chain. Not fire crew, not police. The kind of contractor who fixes a scene before anybody with a badge arrives to ask why it needed fixing. One of them held a clipboard with a city seal on it. That seal had been following me all night. I leaned around the pallet stack just enough to catch a look at the clipboard. Top sheet, emergency service interruption. Bottom line, hydrant main closed for repair. Same lie, same clean stamp, same hand. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. They were going to cut water at the exact moment the warehouse went up, then let the reports say the city got there too late. Behind me, the office door opened again. Vale and Pike had come out onto the catwalk, and Vale was still holding that transfer packet like a dinner napkin. He stopped, looked over the warehouse, and said something I could read plain from the shape of his mouth. "Make sure the fire stays where we want it." Pike nodded once. Then my phone, still dead in my pocket, lit up with a new message from the same unknown number. No sound, just a line of text on the screen. "Do not let him leave the yard. The station is next." I didn't need a second warning. Vale's sedan was already rolling toward the gate, Pike beside it, and the message on my phone had told the truth fast enough to taste. The warehouse yard was still all red yard light and diesel haze, but I was done watching it. I slipped back through the maintenance chase, shouldered the service panel shut behind me, and came out where the brick met the alley. The air there was colder, damp with old rain, and it cut the fuel stank off the back of my throat. I could hear boots in the yard, the hard hat man shouting to somebody near the pickup, and one sharp bark from Pike that sounded like a leash being yanked tight. They thought they'd boxed me in. Fine. I keyed the warehouse phone one last time and called the station house line. No answer. I tried the duty desk. Still no answer. On the third ring, I got a click, then a long, empty hiss, like somebody had picked up and set the receiver down without speaking. That was worse than a busy tone. It meant somebody had touched the line. I hung up, grabbed the rear access card and the brass key, and moved. The quickest route to the station wasn't the main road. It was the service cut behind the freight sheds, the one I'd used 100 times when I was running mutual aid before the city got too fond of its own paperwork. Wet concrete, chain link, the stink of old fryer grease from a closed diner venting into the alley. My boots knew the path better than my head did. I took it at a hard jog, keeping my coat closed with one hand and the other near my belt out of habit. My lungs were already burning from the warehouse dust and that sweet chemical smell, but the body remembers what the mind tries to ignore. 3 blocks in, I caught the station on the far corner through the rows of parked cars. No light in the bay, no crew noise, no diesel hum. That alone put the hairs up on the back of my neck. The front door should have had the lock light on. It didn't. The bay doors were open just a handspan, enough for a man to slip through if he knew what he was doing. I crossed the street low and fast, using the shadow of a delivery van, and got close enough to smell it. Gasoline, fresh enough to sting. Not poured all over, just enough to make the place dangerous if somebody wanted a spark and a story. I stopped at the side entrance and looked through the narrow glass. The watch desk was empty. My coffee mug sat upside down beside the radio base. That was wrong. The mug was always on the right side of the desk because I'd put it there every shift for 12 years. Somebody had moved it. That tiny detail hit harder than I wanted to admit. A sound came from deeper inside, metal on metal, short, controlled. I opened the side door with the brass key, eased it shut behind me, and stepped into my own station with my shoulders square and my breath quiet. The hall smelled too clean, which is never a good sign in a firehouse. Clean means somebody had wiped something. The locker room door was open. My locker stood half ajar, and the little emergency lantern on top had been moved an inch to the left. That was when I saw the wet footprints. Not many. Just enough to cross the tile and stop at the door to the engine bay. One set, narrow, fresh. I kept moving. The bay itself was dark, except for the low red glow from the panel board, and the engines sat there like sleeping animals. My hand brushed the side of engine 2 on the way past. Cold metal. no warmth from the motor block. They'd had time to shut everything down and stand by, or time to wait. I looked down the row and saw the training dummy dragged against the wall, the hose cart tipped on its side, and a dark strip across the concrete that shimmered where somebody had splashed fuel and tried to wipe it thin. Not enough for a fire, enough for panic. That's when a voice spoke from the shadow behind my pump truck. "Captain," it said, low and calm, "you should have stayed in the yard." I didn't turn right away, because I already knew whose voice it was, and I knew there was no way Grant Vale had come alone. I turned the rest of the way and saw Pike in the bay with 2 men and a red fuel can between them. That was enough to tell me the station was no longer a station. It was a box. The bay doors were open only a few inches. The side exits had been propped just wrong, and somebody had already splashed fuel across the concrete in a thin, bright sheen that caught the red panel light like wet glass. They wanted vapors. They wanted me boxed in with the engines and the lockers and the old training gear. Then they wanted 1 match and a clean report. Same trick as the warehouses, only this time the body they wanted buried was mine. Grant Vale stood at the edge of the engine bay with his raincoat still dry, hands folded behind his back like he'd come to inspect a show. Pike was beside him, jaw tight, eyes mean, and the hard-hat man was dragging a short chain across the floor toward the bay door track. The chain clinked once, then went still. I could smell the fuel before I could taste the fear. It sat low and sharp under the station wax, under the rubber, under the old coffee. A whole life's worth of work reduced to one stupid, dangerous scent. "That's a good look on you," Pike said. "You always did understand the room." I did understand it, better than he hoped. The station's emergency exhaust fan was still on the wall by the ceiling line, and the manual release for the roof vents sat under a red flap beside the hose rack. They had not counted on me being able to read my own building faster than they could poison it. I crossed to the hose line, cracked the valve just enough to get pressure, and sent a low fog straight across the floor. Not to fight a fire, to drive the fumes down and break the layer they wanted for ignition. Mist rolled over my boots and over the slick fuel sheen, turning the floor into a gray, moving skin. The hard-hat man swore and stepped back. Good. He'd felt the floor change under him. The station had shifted from a trap to a compartment, and that meant the air had become a weapon on my side. Grant's face didn't move. That bothered me more than Pike's anger. "You think you're smart because you know pipes," he said. "No," I told him. "I'm smart because I know what burns first." I yanked the roof vent release. Metal clattered overhead. A cold draft slammed down through the bay from the high slots, tugging at the mist and pulling the fuel stink up and out. At the same time, I shoved the bay door higher with both hands until the bottom edge rose enough to give the air a clean path. The room breathed hard all at once. That changed the fire picture again. The vapors were no longer sitting in a neat blanket. They were being broken and dragged, which meant their first flare would be ugly, partial, and wrong. Enough to hurt somebody, not enough to finish the job clean. Pike saw what I'd done and snapped, "Get him off the line!" One of the men came at me from the right with his shoulders low and his hands open, the way street muscle moves when it thinks it can close the distance. I met him with the hose coupling, drove the cold metal into his wrist, and heard the bone give under the hit. He went down hard, clutching himself and swearing through his teeth. The other one lunged for the fuel can, but the floor had gone slick under the fog. He slipped, caught the engine bumper with his thigh, and the can banged the concrete and rolled under engine 2. That was the station's own heartbeat right there, a red can under a dead engine. One spark away from a nightmare. Grant finally shifted, reaching into the raincoat. My eyes caught the small silver edge of a lighter before the rest of it came free. "Don't," I said. He looked at me like I was a man asking for a favor. Pike smiled then, just a little, because he thought the gap was still on their side. And under the bay lights, with the exhaust fan howling above us and the floor turning slick as oil, the lighter lid snapped open in Grant Vale's hand. Grant's lighter came up, and I moved before the flame did. I slammed my hand against the red flap on the wall, yanked the roof vent release, and drove the bay door up another foot with my shoulder. The station changed shape around me in the same instant. Hot air climbed, cold air dropped. The fuel smell stopped lying flat on the floor and started moving, broken into thin, ragged threads instead of one clean blanket. That was the whole game right there. Air. If they wanted a backdraft, I'd give the room a draft they couldn't predict. Pike barked my name from the shadow by the pump truck. One of the hired men lunged for the fuel can under the engine bumper. I grabbed the nearest line off the rack, snapped the nozzle, and sent a hard, low fan across the concrete. Mist hammered the floor and slapped the fumes down before they could collect. The man with the can stumbled back coughing, eyes watering, and the lighter in Grant's hand flickered as the moving air tore at it. He still tried to strike it. I crossed the bay in 3 steps, caught his wrist, and folded the hand backward until the lighter dropped. The little metal body hit the wet concrete and skittered under the engine. Grant's face didn't change much, but his shoulder tightened, and I knew I'd found the nerve. Pike came at me from the side, short and fast, a folded length of steel in his right hand. He'd been holding that the whole time, just waiting to see if the lighter would do the job first. It didn't. I met Pike with the hose coupling and drove it into the inside of his elbow. The arm folded wrong. He made a sound through clenched teeth and swung anyway, so I stepped inside the line and hit him again, this time hard in the mouth with the heel of my palm. He went back against the locker row and bounced once off the metal doors. One of them burst open behind him, dumping turnout coats and a coil of old spare hose onto the floor. The hard hat man chose that moment to make a run for the engine bay fuel can. Bad timing. The floor had gone slick under the fog, and his boot slid out from under him. He crashed to one knee, the can banging the bumper and rolling half under engine 2. I got a glimpse of the cap off, fuel slopping across the concrete, and for half a second I thought, that's their real match, not the lighter, the spill. So I stomped it, hard. My boot came down at the edge of the slick, pushing the fuel toward the drain channel instead of the engine. Not away from the fight, just away from the ignition. The room was no longer one trap. It was 3 smaller ones. That mattered. In a firehouse, you don't always win by killing the hazard. Sometimes, you just keep it from joining the others. Pike spit blood and laughed once, ugly and breathless. "You think this saves you?" "No," I said. "This saves the station." I snatched the folder off Grant's dropped coat where it had slid under my boot. Inside were transfer sheets, a cleanup invoice, and a fresh access list stamped with my own station name. Beneath that, a second page with the canal warehouse route and the words, "After ignition, witness moves last." The letters were shaky from the way I was breathing, but I saw enough. They weren't just burning property. They were choreographing witnesses, moving people like debris. Grant had recovered enough to reach into his coat again. I clipped his forearm before he could get his hand out, and something small and hard fell to the concrete. Not a weapon, a burner phone. The screen lit when it hit, and I caught one line before it dimmed. Canal block, 10 minutes. That was the knife. The next one. A sharp blast of static cracked from the station radio on the wall. Then the dispatcher's voice came through, thin and tense, almost swallowed by the hiss. "Captain Reed, if you're on scene, respond canal block immediately. Heavy smoke, possible ignition." Another burst of static, then quieter, like somebody had stepped closer to the mic and didn't want to be heard. "And be careful who's left in the building." I looked up at Grant, then at Pike, then at the hard hat man on his knees by engine 2, and the whole room seemed to tilt toward that call. The station wasn't the finish. It was the bait. Vale had set the station to keep me here, while the canal warehouse lit up somewhere else. And if the dispatcher was right, somebody inside might still be alive. I was already halfway to the canal block when the radio call finished sinking in, and that was the first time all night I let the warehouse behind me stop mattering. Damian Reed drove with one hand locked high on the wheel and the other near the gear shift, cutting through side streets hard enough to make the tires hum over the seams. The station trap, Grant Vale's grin, Pike's lighter, all of it stayed behind him for the length of a heartbeat, and then got pushed under the next problem. The canal block was older than the station, older than most of the clean faces in the city office, and it sat low against the water with a row of blind windows and a loading lane that always held colder air than the street. That mattered. Cold air sinks. Heat climbs. If somebody had staged a fire there the same way they staged the depots, the building would choose its own death before the first engine even got a line on it. Smoke showed before he reached the corner. Not a towering column. A dirty gray spill rolling low along the roofline and bleeding out of the loading bay in thin folds. That told him the fire was still in the room, still starving, still waiting for air. A loaded one, the kind that bites the second a door opens wrong. He killed the headlights, rolled the truck behind a rusted box van, and got out with his coat half zipped and his jaw set. The air tasted of wet brick, old river mud, and a thin chemical thread under it, the same sweet edge he had smelled at the depot and the warehouse yard. Accelerant. Not much, but enough. The smoke drift had already started to stack under the loading overhang, which meant somebody had sealed the wrong side of the building and left the bay breathing through the roof void. He could work with that. He could also die in it if he got greedy. The side door was chained, but not well. One hard pull on the rear access key, and the hook gave with a shriek of rust. He opened the door a handspan and felt the pressure change at once. Hot push from above, cold pull from the alley, and a faint ticking in the walls as the building heated unevenly. That tick told him the frame was already working. Scorch geometry, plain and ugly. The fire was drawing itself toward the office core and the mezzanine void, and if the bay took a rush of fresh air, it would flip inside out. He didn't give it the rush. Damian kicked the door wider only enough to slip through, then crouched low and moved by the left wall where the smoke was thinner. The interior smelled like damp paper, machine oil, and varnish cooking off old pallets. A metal shutter rattled somewhere deeper in the block. Then, from behind a half-closed office partition, came a pounding. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 more. Somebody inside was alive and knew enough to make noise without screaming. He reached the partition, threw it open, and found a watchman tied to a chair with packing tape around his wrists and mouth. The man's eyes were wide enough to show the whites all the way round. Damian ripped the tape, cut the plastic tie with a pocket blade, and hauled him up. The watchman coughed once, bent over, and pointed a shaking finger at the floor hatch under the desk. "They took something down there," he rasped. "Pike and the man in the raincoat. They had a case, and a phone kept ringing after they left." That made the back of Damian's neck go cold. Not because of the case, because of the phone. Men like Pike didn't leave a ringing phone unless they wanted somebody to hear it. He shoved the watchman toward the door and sent him out into the alley, then dropped to the hatch and pried it open with the claw of his tool. Cold air breathed up from below, carrying a second smell under the smoke. Paper, ink, fresh glue. Somebody had turned the basement under the canal block into a hidden office, and they had done it fast. He climbed down 2 steps, hit the landing, and saw a steel desk under a bare bulb, with maps spread over it like a battlefield layout. One of the maps was the station route, another was his house, and the phone on the desk was still ringing, with an unknown number lighting the screen over and over again. He had the desk phone in his hand before the second ring died. The canal block basement had gone stale and close again, smoke pressing through the floorboards above, but the phone kept nagging at him like a loose wire. Damian Reed lifted it, listened to the crackle, and then heard the dispatcher's voice cut through thin and urgent. No small talk, no padding. Just his address and one hard sentence about gas in the house and a front window left open by someone who was already inside. That was enough. He didn't waste a breath on the maps. He didn't need to. The paper on the desk had already told him the rest. Station route, house, next burn. The whole thing was a list now, not a mystery. He shoved the burner phone into his coat, left the hidden office as he found it, and climbed out of the basement 2 steps at a time. On the street, the night air hit his face like cold metal. He got in the truck, backed out without lights, and drove home hard through side streets, one eye on the road, the other on the shape of the city he'd worked for all his life. His house sat dark on a narrow block with no one out front and no porch light showing. That alone told him the crew had done it right. No flame yet, just set up. He killed the engine 2 doors down, crossed the sidewalk, and caught the smell at once. Raw gas seeping from the basement vent and hanging low under the eaves. They'd cut power and opened the line, waiting for him to walk in, breathing like a fool. A room ready to become one. He came in through the side utility door instead of the front, dropped into the basement, and went straight for the meter. The shutoff handle was warm from recent hands. He turned it off, then cracked the small basement windows wide enough to throw the vapors out into the yard before they could pool. That was the whole trick with gas. People think it's the flame that kills them. It's the air mixing wrong. One spark in a tight room, and the walls write the ending for you. He knew that better than anybody in the city. Upstairs, something dragged across the hardwood. Quiet, fast. A hunter. Damian kept low and moved through the basement stairwell into the kitchen, where the back door stood open a finger's width, and the air smelled of wet leaves and fuel. On the table sat one of his own file folders, the same kind of city paper he'd been hunting for days. Beside it, a flashlight, a pistol magazine, and the edge of a black glove. Somebody had been rifling his life line by line. He heard a breath from the hall and froze behind the fridge, just long enough to see a shadow pass the doorway. The hard-hat man, wrist still bad from the office fight, standing in Damian's kitchen like he belonged there. Damian stepped out behind him and drove his forearm into the man's throat, pinning him against the counter. The breath went out of him in one wet grunt. He went for his belt, but Damian had already taken the hand, twisted, and slammed it into the cabinet hard enough to split the knuckles. The pistol clattered out and skidded under the table. The hard-hat man folded forward, coughing, and Damian pressed him down hard enough to make the tile creak under both of them. "Where's Pike?" Damian said. The man tried to smile through the pain. Bad move. Damian hit him once in the side of the face with the heel of his hand and knocked the grin off clean. "Upstairs," the man gasped. "You're too late." That was when Damian heard the floorboard overhead groan. Not his room, the study. Then came another voice from above, calm and close and dry as dust on a hot pipe. "Captain," Grant Vale said from the top of the stairs, "you should have checked your own house first." Damian killed the basement light with one slap, kicked the windows wide, and let the night air chew through the gas before it could settle. The smell was still ugly, sharp enough to sting the back of his throat, but it wasn't a blanket anymore. It was moving. That was the difference between a death trap and a problem you could still solve. Down in the kitchen, the hard-hat man was on one knee, coughing into both hands, his face wet with tears and sweat. Damian hauled him by the collar into the light from the hall and shoved him against the counter hard enough to rattle the plates in the rack. He found a zip tie, a cheap radio, and a key ring with 2 tags on it. One was for a service gate. The other had a number painted in red marker. Station Bay. That one made his jaw tighten. "Grant's upstairs," the man gasped. Damian didn't blink. "Alone?" The man shook his head once, small and scared. "Pike's not here. He already left. Said you'd be busy." Busy. That word almost made him laugh. He looked past the kitchen and into the dark hall where the stairs climbed toward the study. The whole house had been turned into a waiting room for a killing. The basement gas, the open front window, the scattered files on the table, all of it built for one clean ending. Just arranged. He shoved the hard-hat man down into a chair, snapped the zip tie around both wrists to the chair rung, and left him there, breathing hard with his own fear. Then he took the key ring, crossed the hall, and went upstairs with the same careful steps he used on weak floors in a fire. The boards under his boots creaked once, then settled. On the landing, the air smelled of old paper and the cedar polish his wife used to like. That smell hit him harder than the gas ever could. The study was wrecked, drawers hanging open, files on the floor, the safe door standing open with the inside empty. Grant Vail was by the window with a pistol in one hand and Damian's pension folder in the other, looking over the pages like he was checking a delivery note. He turned only halfway when Damian came in. "Should have checked the basement first," Grant said. Damian took one look at the pistol, the open window, the way Grant's feet were spaced, and knew the man wasn't bluffing. He also knew the room. Narrow, one exit, bookshelf on the left, desk on the right, ceiling low enough to keep a man honest. A bad room for a gun. A better room for a man who understood how to take away distance. Grant raised the pistol a fraction. Damian slammed the study door shut behind him and drove straight at the bookshelf. Wood exploded sideways. Books, frames, and a heavy lamp fell in a crashing wave between them, buying just enough cover. Grant fired once. The round punched the wall and tore plaster into the air. Damian hit the desk edge shoulder first, spun, and took the gun wrist with both hands before Grant could reset. The grip was slick with sweat. He twisted hard. The pistol barked again into the ceiling, and Grant snarled through his teeth. Not enough. Damian shoved him into the wall beside the window and jammed his forearm under the jaw, pinning him there. Grant fought dirty, driving a knee up and clawing at Damian's coat, but the old fire captain had done this kind of close work in smoke, in dark, with worse men than this. He snatched the phone from Grant's inside pocket and shoved him away just enough to look at the screen. The phone was live, not a call, a camera feed. His station, the engine bay. Red light, fuel on the floor, and moving through it, half in shadow behind engine 2, was a figure with a flashlight and a jerry can. Damian's face went still. On the feed, the bay door shuttered once, and somewhere in the background, a siren started to rise. Thin at first, then sharp enough to cut straight through the house. The siren in the study kept climbing, thin and ugly, while Grant Vail stared at the phone screen like it had turned into a confession. Damian Reed took one hard step back and looked past Grant's shoulder, through the bedroom doorway toward the hallway where the stairs dropped to the kitchen below. The house was full of motion now, not the random kind, the organized kind. The hard-hat man downstairs was shouting up through the stairwell. Another set of feet hit the porch boards outside. Pike had brought backup. Of course he had. Men like that never walk into a trap without 2 exits and a clean shirt. Grant's lighter hand had gone slack for a second, and Damian used it. He twisted the wrist, drove the edge of the phone into the web of skin between thumb and palm, and the lighter clattered onto the study rug. The gun wavered. Damian struck the forearm with the heel of his hand, heard the joint give a wet little pop, and took the pistol out of line before Grant could recover. A tight one. Grant staggered against the desk, face blank now except for the strain around the eyes. The phone feed still showed the station bay, red lit and half shadowed, with a figure moving behind engine 2 carrying a jerry can. Damian didn't need the image to tell him what it meant. The station was the real hit. His house had been only the bait to keep him pinned while they made the final move. Below them, the dispatcher's voice crackled again through the phone speaker and then cut out in static. The siren on the feed kept wailing. Somewhere far off in the city streets, another engine answered. Too late. Maybe not too late if he moved like hell. Grant tried to grin through the pain. "Too many rooms, Captain. You can't cover them all." Damian shoved him into the desk lamp hard enough to break the base. Glass tinkled across the wood. "I don't have to cover all of them," he said. "Just the ones you thought were empty." He kicked the study door open and took the stairs 2 at a time, gun in his left hand, the phone in his right. At the landing, he heard the hard hat man downstairs yelling again, a raw, frightened sound now, and then a slam from the basement door. Somebody had gone back down there. The gas might still be waiting, or the open window, or both. That was the thing about a trap house. Every room had a bad answer. Damian didn't go to the basement. He moved for the front hall, because if Pike had left a man inside, the man would be aiming to cut him off from the street. The front door was already open a crack. Cold air came through, carrying the stink of fuel from outside. He checked the angle, then rolled into the hall and caught a shape by the coat rack. The hard hat man. He came up with both hands empty, eyes wild, probably hoping to buy time by being unarmed. Damian didn't waste the time. He hit him with the pistol butt across the temple, once, hard. The man folded without drama, dropping straight to the floorboards like a sack. Damian stepped over him, yanked the front door wider, and saw the dark shape of another sedan idling at the curb with its lights off. Pike's people. He crossed the porch and snapped a look into the yard. The station feed still glowed on the phone, but the image had shifted. The bay door was open wider now, and a streak of orange had begun to lick the bottom edge of the frame. Not enough flame to roar yet, enough to breathe, enough to build. Damian felt the old cold tighten in his chest. That was the backdraft waiting to happen, not from this house, from the station. If the vapors in the bay found the wrong spark, his own engines, his own gear, maybe the whole bay would flash in one ugly wave. Vale had sent a man with fuel into his home, just to delay him, while the real kill sat on a timer back at the station. He tucked the phone under his arm, grabbed the fallen keyring from the hall table, and looked one last time at the study behind him. Grant Vale was there at the top of the stairs now, one arm hanging wrong, face pale, trying to decide whether to follow. Damian made the decision for him. He raised the pistol and fired once into the floor by Grant's feet. A warning. Grant stopped dead. Then Damian turned, ran for the truck, and the phone in his coat lit again with a new message from the unknown number. "Don't come back to the station by road. They're waiting at the bay." By the time Damian Reed got back to the station, the bay was already crowded with flashing lights and hard faces. Not flames. Not yet. Just the kind of pressure that comes before a bad room goes bad. He killed the truck at the curb and stepped out into wet asphalt and diesel glare. The old firehouse standing there with its doors half open and its breath coming hot and sour through the seams. Grant Vale's sedan was pinned by 2 patrol cars. Pike was outside in cuffs, jacket torn, face gray under the red wash. The hard hat man sat on the curb with his hands zip-tied and his jaw hanging loose like he still couldn't believe the night had turned around on him. Damian didn't waste time on them. He pushed through the side door into his own bay and found the last of the traps still alive. Fuel on the concrete, a lighter in Grant's coat pocket. One of the engines dead, and one line charged and ready because his crew had gotten the dispatcher's warning just in time. The vapors were hanging low enough to choke on, but the roof vents were already open, and the exhaust fan was pulling hard. He dropped to a knee, drove the hose nozzle low, and sent a flat fan across the floor, breaking the fuel haze into ragged strips before it could gather into one clean kill pocket. Pike saw him and started barking for Grant to run. Grant tried, badly. He made it 3 steps before Damian caught him by the collar and slammed him against the engine hatch. The clean raincoat tore at the shoulder. Grant swung once with a cuffed hand and missed, all teeth and panic now, no polish left on him at all. Pike lurched toward the bay door, but the state trooper on the apron caught him by the back of the neck and put him face first into the hood of the sedan. The station filled with the sound of boots, radios, and one sharp hiss as the bay floor finally cleared under the moving air. Damian looked up at the ceiling fans, then back at the floor, and for 1 second he could see the whole night laid out in pieces. The hydrants shut off on his probationer, the depot burns, the station papers, his house, Nolan's helmet on the table, Pike's neat files, and Grant's clean hands. It had all been one machine, and every gear had turned because they thought the old fire captain was only good for walking into hot rooms and pulling strangers out. He was still good at that. He was also good at seeing the room before it lied. When the detectives came in with the folders from the canal block, the house files, and the title packet from Grant's coat, nobody had to explain very much. The names were already in ink. The transfer pages, the inspection stamps, the shutdown orders, the route sheets with his own house marked in red. Pike stopped talking after the second set of signatures hit the table. Grant tried once to smile for the cameras and couldn't hold it. By dawn, the story had already changed. A rigged chain with a developer at one end and a bought inspector at the other. The wisdom of it wasn't complicated. A wet hose stretched straight across a black floor can save a bay. A clean line held long enough can keep a whole building from swallowing itself. Some nights that's all a man gets. A line, a fan, and the stubborn choice to keep the room from closing. By sunrise, the bay was only wet concrete, cold engines, and the silence after a siren dies down. Damian hung Nolan's helmet on the training hook next to his own and stood there a long moment with his hands on the rim, listening to the station settle back into itself. The air smelled of soap and rain now, not gas. That was enough. He looked once at the open doors, once at the sky turning pale over the apron, and then he went to put the kettle on. If this kind of hard-edged fire story pulled you in, subscribe and leave a comment with the moment you knew the trap had turned.